Hello and welcome again. I am Mr. Fose, and in this lecture we're going to talk about social factors and how they affect conservation biology and how conservation biology affects social factors. What's important to understand from this lecture is social factors have a strong influence on how we view the natural world and how we choose to treat it. So what we'll discuss in this chapter are how cultures and religions affect conservation biology, how gender differences can be a factor, the difference between people living in rural versus urban situations, and how certain values can emerge in our perspective of conservation and nature. So if we consider things like cultures and religions, one of the places we can look is the way that we treat animals. For instance, dogs in places like the United States are treated very differently than they are in places who maybe value them for different reasons. For example, some cultures traditionally eat dogs, and even though this is becoming less common, it's still practiced in many places. So something that may be a pet to us may be food for someone else. Also, things like cows. Cows are consumed quite regularly in Western culture, but in some Eastern cultures and Eastern religions, they're considered to be sacred and would never be eaten. Also, things like insects provide a primary amount of protein for a lot of cultures, and many people in the U.S. culture would never consider eating insects as food. Something else to consider are rats. Rats are seen as a pest, as a nuisance to most people living in the U.S., but in many Asian and African cultures, they are food. In fact, in Nigeria, there's one species of rat that sells for more than beef at the market. When we take a closer look at religions, we see that traditionally religions have had things to say about how the natural world works and how people treat it. Some religions explain a sameness with humans and with nature, while other religions explain separateness, and some religions do both at the same time and even contradict themselves. So if we take a look at monotheisms and we examine the Old Testament of Christianity, here's a statement that explains how we can treat the land. And it says, "Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field until no space is left and you live alone in the land." And this was from Isaiah 5:8. And this can be interpreted a number of ways, but generally it's assumed to mean that it's a bad idea to completely use all of the land, and it's a bad idea to leave very little natural spaces. If we look at some of the other monotheisms like Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, they generally explain the role that humans play in the natural world as part of the system, that humans are one part and so are all other species, and that we should try our best to live in harmony. So we see here that religions have traditionally taken a stance on the way that humans interact with the natural world, and these type of messages influence the way we practice conservation. But the way that we practice conservation in terms of what religions tell us aren't always good things. Here we see two examples. One, the Ganges River in India. This is the sacred river to the Hindu religion. And because it's sacred, often what they do is decorate their bodies. Often they'll burn them, or sometimes just release the corpses before they've been burned into the river. So it's commonplace in the Ganges River to see floating corpses of humans and cows, and even though this is their sacred religion, their sacred river, and it is considered to be a direct path to heaven, it's considered also to be the most polluted river in the world. It's full of human bodies, dead cows, and human waste and other types of pollution. So if you see this picture on the left, this is a ceremonially dressed corpse which is floating in the Ganges River. If we look at this example lower right of a Franciscan priest who lives in Kenya and has been there for 30 years, and he's now called the Father of Trees by locals, and he has been planting trees, and the number that he's planted now has exceeded 1 million trees, and he claims that he's invested about $50,000 in this project, and that the forests that now exist where he's planted trees are worth about $5 million. And they've also provided soil stabilization. They have helped to maintain rivers and clean waters, and they've also helped keep the locals in the region instead of evacuating as they were previously doing because the land was becoming unusable. So here are two examples of good and bad, what can come from religious people affecting the environment. We also see that there are differences between people living in urban and rural environments. So just to clarify, urban is the city life. This is where there's a high concentration of people. Rural is a lower concentration of people, and typically we say this would be the country. And there are different values that emerge from both of these groups. So if we start with the rural environment, what we see is people who live in rural settings or live in the country are typically more in touch with the environment. They may be affected specifically by individual species, and their view of ecosystems is a traditional ecological knowledge where they are more closely interacting with nature. So they may have a better practical understanding of things like natural cycles of plants and animals, and the effect of day length and temperature changes throughout the year on natural ecological cycles. Also, we typically see people who live in a rural setting have a utilitarian attitude towards the environment, which is more how can we use the land, in what ways can we make use of it. And even though these people may be in better touch with the environment and natural systems, and maybe know the names of more plants and animals around them than the urban dweller, it doesn't mean that they necessarily are practicing conservation or that they are stewards of the environment. That's something that can happen regardless of the environment in which you live. So if we compare the rural to the urban, what we see is people living in urban environments are typically isolated from nature. People who live in cities come in contact with natural systems, with species, with plants and animals less often. Typically, the cost for them to advocate for biodiversity is lower, or they're more detached from it. And their knowledge of how systems work is more conceptual. It's something that they may have learned through classes, through watching documentaries, or through talking to people, and not something that they've learned as much from hands-on experience. But even though people live in urban environments and live in the city, doesn't mean that they can't also be stewards for the environment and practice conservation. And so typically the viewpoints of these people and the way that they practice conservation is different depending on the place where they live. And that's because the place you live is going to affect your lifestyle, and any changes that you make to it or any management strategies that you deploy in your environment could affect you. So here's one example of how urban and rural people clashed over one issue. If you're aware, in Yellowstone National Park, wolves were reintroduced back in the 90s. And Yellowstone is a very rural environment. In fact, very few people live in the surrounding areas of Yellowstone. And so this was a great place to reintroduce wolves. But there was a lot of pushback from mostly people, local farmers who have livestock. Well, there was also a proposal to reintroduce wolves into the Adirondack Park north of New York City. So people living in the city typically voted to reintroduce wolves. They saw this as a benefit. They understood that having predators in an ecosystem were beneficial to the way an ecosystem functions, and they voted to bring the wolves back. Rural voters, people who lived in the country, who lived near and around the park, voted against it. They saw wolves as a potential threat to their livelihood, to their livestock, and to their safety. And so eventually the reintroduction of wolves was blocked, mostly by the votes of rural voters. We also see that gender can have an influence on how we practice conservation. Traditionally, females, women, were not considered to be people who could practice conservation. If we look at a historical perspective of conservation, there are very few women who have been working in conservation. There is still a belief among some people that things like hiking and hunting and fishing are a man's place, and that this isn't something that women can enjoy. But this is a viewpoint that is shifting, and it's good that it's shifting, because when women experience equal rights in their community, then the environment benefits. And specifically, the main factor that we see when women experience equal rights is human population growth declines. And anywhere we see the most rapid human population growth, we typically see the most rapid environmental degradation. So there's a strong social component related to how genders are treated. Also, you may be aware of this group of all-female wildlife officers. This is an anti-poaching troop of wildlife officers in South Africa called the Black Mambas, and they've been recognized recently as winners of the Champions of the Earth Award because of their perseverance and their hard work in conservation. Also, the language we often use to describe nature is feminine in nature. Anyways, you may have heard the terms Mother Earth or Mother Nature to describe natural systems. We also can talk about values and how those affect things like conservation. For example, if you reference page 337 in your textbook, you may see this list and the description of how these things can affect our view of natural processes and of conservation. For example, you may look at this picture and think, wow, that's the cutest thing I've ever seen. Or you may look at this picture and think, I could make a lot of money if I sold those things. Or you may think, in a couple of months, they're all going to be big and I could eat them. So when we consider those different viewpoints, those all stem from different values. So if we run through this list, we see people may have a naturalistic value, and they may say something like, these animals are part of nature, and because they are part of nature, we should let them be. Or you may have an ecologistic value that you place on this, where you say, these animals are part of an ecosystem, and when they're present, an ecosystem functions best. You may place a humanistic value on this image and think, these animals are here for me, or maybe you recognize that these animals are living beings and also have rights similar to those of humans. There are moralistic values that we use to guide our decisions, where we often attempt to weigh what's right or wrong in the big picture. We could use a scientific value where our understanding of science can influence how we treat other things. Or we may also view these animals as potential scientific information that we can gain knowledge from. Or maybe you just think they're pretty. That would be an aesthetic value. Or maybe you find some use for them, as I mentioned before, to sell or to eat. That would be a utilitarian value. Or a doministic value, where you recognize that these animals are here for our use and our benefit. Or maybe you have a negativistic value, and you say, all they do is poop on everything. I have no use for these things. They're gross. I don't like them. Or maybe you have a neutralistic value, and you look at these animals and say, I don't care. I don't even care. Whatever. Get them out of my face. So values are interesting because values can change. And when we think about how values change, I'd like to ask you all, how? How can values change? And when we attempt to answer this question, one of the things to consider is this quote. And what it tells us is, in the end we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. And we will understand only what we are taught. And this should indicate that values can change based on changing our understanding and changing what we understand by being taught new things. And the main way that values can change is through education, either through information, where we can learn about biodiversity by taking a class, reading a book, watching a video, or through experience, where we get out and get our hands on things, where we take a walk in nature, where we understand how things actually function by viewing them up close or interacting with them. So here's a picture of Mrs. Fose teaching her conservation biology students about biodiversity in wildflowers. She's the one with the hat in the middle. As an educator myself, I see firsthand how people's values change on a regular basis when they're exposed to new things and when they're educated. One of my favorite things to do is introduce people who don't often spend much time outside to natural processes, to take them in the woods, to teach them how things work and show them wildlife, show them plants, and explain to them how those plants and animals are interacting in a natural system. Here's one example of how values changed in Texas. Texas, like many states, was experiencing a problem with pollution and litter. People were dumping trash out of their car windows. Well, like many states, they also had those typical signs that said, littering will earn you a $500 fine. And that doesn't seem to have much of an effect on whether people litter or not. Well, they started a campaign where the signs now say, don't mess with Texas, which is kind of a slogan for people who live in Texas. And they identified this as a sense of pride. And this actually helped to reduce littering in Texas by approximately 74%. Values can also change if we are educated, or if we take an approach that is different than other people. So, for instance, animal rights groups in the United States have worked to remove dogs from, or to ban dogs from being consumed in some Asian countries. It still happens, but it's now illegal, and it happens much less. Also, we consider values like anthropocentrism versus biocentrism, where anthropocentrism basically recognizes human beings as the center of the universe, or as the center of all processes on Earth, and every animal and every process is here to serve us. Whereas biocentrism recognizes that we are one of many species on Earth, and we function in an ecosystem as one part of a whole, just like every other organism. And there's another value that has been developed or explained by E.O. Wilson, and this is called biophilia. And this is a term that he coined to describe people who have an affinity for nature and a love for biology. And typically, this is the type of people who focus their efforts on conservation. Often these people seek jobs in biological disciplines or in teaching others biology or in practicing conservation. And I know you all have heard of E.O. Wilson because this is one of many things that he's done, and he is a champion of conservation and biology. Well, that's it for this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed. Thanks.